Before Canada was a country, before it had a name, and long before the maple leaf waved in the wind, this land was already alive. It held thousands of years of stories, rich cultures, and powerful nations. It wasn't empty, it wasn't waiting to be discovered, it was already home. This is the story of Canada. Before it was Canada, the first chapter of Canada's story begins over 12,000 years ago. As glaciers retreated and life returned to the land, indigenous peoples, Inuit in the Arctic, First Nations across the forests and plains, and Métis in later generations, formed vibrant societies with complex cultures, systems of government, trade routes, and spiritual beliefs. On the west coast, the Haida and Tlingit carved great cedar canoes and totem poles. On the plains, Blackfoot and Cree followed bison herds and built vast alliances. In the east, the Mi'kmaq and Iroquois Confederacy managed diplomacy, agriculture, and law. These were not scattered tribes, they were nations. In the late 1400s, European powers set their eyes on the New World. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing for England, landed near present-day Newfoundland. He wasn't the first. Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had arrived centuries earlier, but Cabot's voyage would help launch a wave of European interest. By the early 1500s, French explorers began mapping the St. Lawrence River. Among them was Jacques Cartier, who, in 1534, claimed the land for France. He met indigenous people along the way, traded with them, named the land Canada from the Huron-Iroquois word Kanata, meaning village, but he also planted a flag that would change everything. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City, establishing the first major permanent French settlement. This was the beginning of New France. Unlike the Spanish in the south, the French built their empire slowly focused on fur trade, alliances, and missionary work. They worked with Huron, Algonquin, and Montagnais peoples, often marrying into communities, forming trading relationships, and learning indigenous languages. But they also brought disease, competition, and conflict. Rivalries between indigenous nations were worsened by European weapons and politics, and another European power was on the move. While the French were building New France, the British were expanding their own presence. By the early 1700s, they had taken control of Nova Scotia and were pushing into the St. Lawrence Valley. The two empires, France and Britain, were now on a collision course. From the forests of Quebec to the shores of Hudson Bay, tensions grew. Trade turned into territorial competition. Treaties turned into betrayals. And in the background, indigenous nations found themselves caught between two colonial giants. Then came the war that changed it all. Canada's roots are older than maps, deeper than borders, but when empire met empire, everything changed. We'll uncover the battle for control, how Britain took New France, what happened to the indigenous peoples, and how the seeds of modern Canada were planted in a storm of war. By the mid-1700s, Canada was not yet a country, but it was already a prize. Two European powers fought to control it, indigenous nations fought to protect it, and out of this chaos would rise something unexpected. The idea of a new kind of nation. This is the story of how Canada moved from colonial battleground to the first steps toward independence. In the 1750s, France and Britain were locked in a global war. In North America, it was known as the French and Indian War. The heart of the fight? Control over Canada. The British had more people and more military strength. The French had strong alliances with indigenous nations, especially the Huron and Algonquin. But after years of battles, sieges, and ambushes, the decisive blow came in 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. Both Generals Wolfe and Montcalm died, but the British won. And in 1763, France officially surrendered all its Canadian territory to Britain. New France was no more. Now, the British had a problem. They ruled a land full of French-speaking Catholics who had no desire to become British. To avoid rebellion, they passed the Quebec Act of 1774, allowing French Canadians to keep their language, religion, and civil law. This angered the 13 colonies to the south, who were already on the edge of revolution. Some even wanted to invade Canada and make it the 14th colony, but Quebec did not join the American Revolution. It stayed loyal to Britain. After the American War of Independence, around 40,000 Loyalist people who had stayed loyal to the British Crown fled to Canada. Many settled in what is now Ontario, and others in the Maritimes. They brought with them English customs, Protestant churches, and democratic ideas. In 1791, Britain divided Canada into Upper Canada, English-speaking, and Lower Canada, French-speaking, trying to manage the growing diversity. But not everyone was happy. discontent grew, tensions flared, and in 1837, rebellion broke out. Led by men like Louis-Joseph Papineau and William Lyon Mackenzie, Canadians in both Upper and Lower Canada demanded more self-rule, more democracy, and an end to elite control. The rebellions failed, but they scared the British. In response, Lord Durham was sent to investigate. His report led to the Act of Union in 1841, merging the two Canadas into one, and recommending responsible government where the colony's leaders were elected by the people. Canada was still part of the British Empire, but it was beginning to run itself. By the 1860s, something big was brewing. The United States was recovering from its Civil War. The British didn't want to pay for Canada's defense, and the Canadian provinces were struggling to manage trade, politics, and growth on their own. In 1864, leaders met in Charlottetown to discuss uniting into one country. French and English Canadians, along with representatives from the Maritimes, debated, bargained, and finally agreed. On July 1st, 1867, the Dominion of Canada was born. It started with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Canada was no longer just a colony, it was a nation in progress. Canada's path to independence wasn't won in a single battle, it was built in careful steps, difficult compromises, and quiet revolutions. But even in Confederation, many voices were still missing. We'll explore how Canada expanded westward, how Indigenous peoples were pushed aside, and how the modern country was shaped through trials, treaties, and truth. Canada became a country in 1867, but the land it claimed had already been lived on, loved, and defended for thousands of years. In building a new nation, Canada would grow from coast to coast, but at a cost. Treaties would be signed, cultures erased, and the wounds of that past still echo today. This is the story of modern Canada, a story of growth, pain, and a promise to do better. After Confederation, Canada began to grow. Manitoba joined in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and eventually all the provinces and territories. But this expansion wasn't just political, it was physical. Canada wanted to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To do that, they needed land that didn't belong to them. To gain it, the government signed numbered treaties with Indigenous nations agreements that promised land rights, resources, and respect. In exchange, Indigenous peoples were asked to give up vast territories, but the promises were often broken. In 1885, Canada completed the Canadian Pacific Railway, linking the East and West by steel. It was a powerful symbol of unity, but it was built on struggle. Thousands of Chinese laborers were brought in to do the most dangerous work. Often for less pay and in deadly conditions, many died. And once the railway was finished, Chinese immigrants faced harsh discrimination, including a head tax and exclusion acts. Meanwhile, on the prairies, Métis leader Louis Riel led a second resistance, demanding land rights for his people. He was captured and executed, deepening the divide between French and English Canada. To assimilate Indigenous peoples, the government created a system of residential schools. Indigenous children were taken from their families, forbidden to speak their languages, and forced into English or French education run by churches. Many suffered abuse, neglect, and loss of identity. Thousands never returned home. The last residential school closed in 1996. The trauma is still felt today. In recent years, the unmarked graves of children have been discovered on school grounds, sparking grief and a national reckoning. In the 20th century, Canada began to define itself internationally. It fought in 2 world wars, joined the United Nations, and helped craft global peacekeeping missions. In 1965, Canada adopted its iconic maple leaf flag. In 1982, it gained full legal independence from Britain with the Constitution Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, championed by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. At the same time, Canada began welcoming immigrants from all over the world. Today, cities like Toronto and Vancouver are among the most diverse on Earth. But challenges remain, from the Anglophone-Francophone divide to Indigenous reconciliation to debates over identity. Canada continues to ask, what kind of country do we want to be? Canada's story is not a straight line. It is a tapestry of nations, languages, struggles, and second chances. A land built on both dreams and broken promises, still learning, still growing. If this story moved you, hit like, comment, "We are still here," and subscribe for more powerful stories from around the world. Because Canada isn't just history, it's a question we keep answering together.